Welcome to Polaris Live. This is Sarwar Kashmeri welcoming our viewers from around the world to this series of programs on the United States and China in the world. This program is the second in a special series which Polaris Live has invited 7 experts from the U.S., China, and the Middle East to offer their perspectives on the recently concluded 20th Communist Party Conference in Beijing. These programs are brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association in New York. I'd like to remind our viewers that you can ask questions throughout the program using the comment button on the right-hand side of the screen. Time permitting, we'll get to as many of them as we possibly can. My guest on Polaris Live today is Dr. Wu Xinbo, Professor and Dean, Institute of International Studies, and Director at the Center for American Studies, Fudan University in China. He teaches and researches China's foreign and security policy, Sino-U.S. relations, and U.S.-Asia-Pacific policy, author of numerous publications, including Dollar Diplomacy and Major Powers in China, 1909 to 1913, Turbulent Water, U.S.-Asia-Pacific Security Strategy in the Post-Cold War Era. He's also contributed chapters to numerous publications from well-known academic institutions such as Columbia University, Oxford University, and so on. Dr. Wu serves on the Policy Advisory Board of the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's wonderful to have you, and welcome to Polaris Live, Dr. Wu.
Thank you. Thank you for your invitation.
Well, you're quite welcome, and it's a real pleasure to have you. Dr. Wu, let me start off by reading to you the latest Economist magazine. On the cover has a 4-word headline, "The World China Wants," with a rather provocative picture of President Xi Jinping. Reading further, one comes across this quote, "The question of the age is whether China will play by rules that other powers can accept." Your reaction?
Well, I think this question is vaguely defined. Whether China play by the rules that other powers can accept. What kind of rules? When we talk about international relations, some rules are very important. For example, the respect of sovereignty and territorial integrity of other sovereign states, non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries, no use of force or threat to use force against others, and not to launch unilateral sanctions against others. All these rules are important, and they are embodied in UN Charter as well as in international law. I think China certainly play by this kind of rules. Other countries, particularly the United States, they may say they accept, but in reality, they don't. So sometimes there is a difference between China and others like the United States. The United States invaded Iraq, Afghanistan, devastated Libya, and militarily intervened in Syria. What kind of rules does the U.S. observe when it took those actions? So I think for China, it's very clear. China plays by the rules that is enshrined in UN Charter and international law. China is not going to play by the rules that unilaterally set by the U.S. and its allies. So I think that is the way China defines its role in the world. And also, China tries to promote the reform of the current international system, making it more inclusive. fairer, and also representing more of the voice of the developing countries. So in this sense, China, as it gets more powerful and stronger, also tries to reform the current international system, not to topple the current international system. So in that sense, China is trying to become a constructive force for the current international order rather than a destructive force in the order. After all, China has been a major beneficiary of the current international order in the last several decades because of China's open door policy, reform, and joining the international economy. China has developed quickly and improved remarkably the livelihood of its people. So I think China will do a lot to help maintain the current international system while also work to improve it.
Let me ask you, without getting into discussing, which we can come to later, the issue that is always brought up, that yes, that may be right, what you've just said, but the fact still remains that in dealings between the United States and China, items come up which cause America a great deal of concern. For example, here is, for example, the idea of intellectual property. The point is always made that America is a very open society and China is not, and you may want to comment on that. And that there is always the perception that because of its openness, that its trade and corporate secrets are easy for China to take away, and so that's an issue that always comes up. The idea of censorship of the media always comes up, so that there's the question of whether the Chinese people are really hearing what Americans want to say or the American government wants to say. Right. So, and then the whole idea of militarizing the South China Sea, the idea of expanding control in the 9-dash line, which basically says that all of the waters in the South and East China Sea basically belong to China. That others are opposed to it. That, I mean, all of these things come up. So I want to ask you, two wrongs don't make a right. So how do you address all of these issues, and especially the closed nature of Chinese society? How do you work around that?
Well, first of all, I think China and the U.S. are two different societies. We have very different cultures and histories. So it's not the right way to judge one society by one's own experience. So we are just two different societies. And two, as someone who was born in China and has grown up in China, I always compare China today with the past, with China 20, 30, 40 years ago. And when I reflect on this, I can easily say the change and the development of China, not only economically, but socially, culturally, and in many other ways. So if you have people, traveling abroad every year, I mean, before the pandemic, every year you had about 100 million people traveling abroad. How can you say this is a closed society, right? So if you have the access to the WeChat social media in China, you can see how lively people are discussing on their social media, from food to politics, okay, from hairstyle to the fashion, everything. So I think this is a very vibrant, very open society from a Chinese point of view. A big change from what China was 20 years ago and 30 years ago. So you cannot, simply say, oh, because China is different from the US, so it's a closed society, and its people do not have the opportunity to express themselves, which is not true. Which is not true. Yeah.
Let, let me go back again to the headline that the world China wants. It
Mhm.
almost seems to me that what you are saying, Dr. Wu, is that listen, we have a system in China that's come up from our own history, and you have a system in America and the West called liberal democracy. Just
Mhm.
using a phrase that's often used, and you seem to be suggesting that China system has done as much good for it as the liberal democracy system has done for the West. Are you suggesting that as the two superpowers enter the 21st century, that they should accept the fact that there will be two different, if you will, systems that are used in each one of the superpowers, China and the United States, and that one way that we might soften this daggers drawn relationship between the two is to accept that and not insist on either power trying to say that its system is the best.
Well, we are two different societies, and each side is governed in its own way. Uh, it's not the right thing to say, one country's way of governance is better than the other country. And in fact, we have to admit that every society, every country has its own problem. For example, in China, many people, not just the scholars who study the US, they're always puzzled by the gun violence in the United States. Why in the US, you allow people to have guns and kill each other. And on a daily basis, innocent people, children in schools, they become the victim of gun violence. How come a country be governed like that? So should China insist that the US should address this issue before we we can have a decent relationship? No. We know that's a problem for the US, and this problem has to be solved by the Americans. The same applies to the Chinese side. I'm not saying that China is perfect in its governance. There are also many problems. So will these problems become the preconditions for the US to engage China? No, it shouldn't. It
Let
shouldn't.
me interject here. You have correctly pointed out that the gun violence is an issue that America will have to deal with. But I'm sure you know, but many people don't, that this is a constitutional right in America to bear arms, right? It's written in the Constitution, the Second Amendment. And to change the Constitution, which is the same, I believe, in your country, you need to go through a very elaborate process. And Americans hold their Constitution quite dearly. But so I just wanted to point that out. It's not a simple issue to resolve, even though it appears on the surface to be. But given that, I think the more important point that you're making, which I think comes out from what you just said, is that there are issues on both sides that are very germane to the society, the rule of the constitution of both countries. And I think you're suggesting that it is not helpful to make those issues, which cannot easily be changed, preconditions for the two countries talking to one another. Is that the important point you're trying to make?
I think there's always a difference between foreign policy and internal affairs. So we should try not to mix these two things together. When we think about relations with each other, and we should not put our hand into the internal affairs of the other side. That's a wise way to do it. Otherwise, it will go nowhere.
Okay. Let me tangent, if you don't mind, Dr. Wu, to the conference that just ended in Beijing, the one-week conference. I've spent decades in America, and I haven't seen as much importance being paid to the 5-yearly conference that I can remember. For some reason, this has taken equal spotlight from Wonder Woman and other programs which go on all the time. So I want to ask you, in your opinion, what were some of the key results from this conference? And how do you comment, I'll just add this question, on those who say that President Xi Jinping broke the norm that existed in China, that only 2 terms per president, and then the person moves on. And the comment is made that because that was changed, we can now no longer predict where China is headed, because that was such a strong norm that it should have not just been changed by one person. So how do you just those 2 things, your take on the most important some of the key items from the conference, and 2, this comment about President Xi Jinping becoming the most powerful leader since Mao Zedong?
Well, for your first question, the key results, in my opinion, twofold. One is that there's now a new team of leaders led by President Xi to govern China in the next 5 years. So we see some new faces in the top leadership. And second is there's a blueprint for China's development and governance in the next 5 years, as laid out in the Party Congress report. For example, promoting common prosperity, enhancing innovation-driven economic growth, promoting new type of industrialization, and stressing more on the development of real economy, and promoting national reunification with Taiwan. So this blueprint will be reflected in the next 5 years governance in China. Now, certainly, President Xi is a strong leader, very powerful. I think, however, people in China think about this issue somewhat different from the opinions you just mentioned. Some outside of China, they like to think about this issue as a matter of power politics, whether the power is balanced or checked or not. Okay, but in China, people view this more as a matter of governance. That means we should have a strong leader, and he should be powerful enough so that he can deliver on what he promises in the governance of China. And in fact, what President Xi has done in the last 10 years, like anti-corruption, protection of environment, poverty alleviation, promoting social justice, and also resisting the pressure, the strategic pressure from the United States, from Donald Trump's trade war against China to Biden's technological war against China. He has proved himself to be a strong and capable leader. So in China, ordinary people have very high expectation on him to continue to do this in the next 5 years. And so the question in China, the concern in China is not about power, but about governance. How you will deliver as the strong leader of China. So I think that's people's expectation on him. And actually, there is a very high expectation on President Xi and his team for what he is going to do in the next 5 years. This is a time that China is facing great challenges, both at home and abroad. So you really need a capable and strong leader to navigate the country through these dangerous waters. That's what most people in China think about.
Thank you for that. And so I wanted to relate it to this issue. China's economy is slowing down because of many things, but a lot of people point out that the zero COVID policy that is being followed is a big reason that the economy has slowed down, dampened, and at least we have the impression here that a lot of people in China, especially in the powerhouse cities of Shanghai and so on, would like to see this end, to get more in line with the West, where we can open up and connect again, so that China again becomes a part of the world trading system as much as it used to be, and opens up. Is there that much opposition to this policy as we read here? And why would China not want to get rid of this so that they can move along with the rest of the world? Is it because well, let me just stop there. Why do you think that?
Well, good question. I live in Shanghai, so I experienced this kind of lockdown imposed in early April and May this year. I think the COVID-19 is a kind of unprecedented pandemic, and the world has paid very high price for that. For example, in the U.S. now you have more than 1 million people died from it. So we should be very vigilant towards this. In China, if you think about 1 million people died out of this, that will be a disaster, not only for the country, but also for the ruling party, for the government. So in the last 2 years, China has done very well in dealing with the pandemic. So I think that's part of the reason the central government in Beijing believes that we should continue to keep this record. And also for a pragmatic reason is that because China has big population, especially a big aging population, and the percentage of people, the aging people that has been vaccinated is relatively low, and there is no efficient and effective medical treatment for this pandemic. So I think this is also the reason why in China we still keep relatively strict measures in place. However, as the virus becomes less virulent, I think people hope that we can gradually ease up the policy. Now, I don't think people will say we should be just like in the United States. We just give up on this policy and let it be. No people think that way in China. They just think that we should gradually ease up the control of flow of population, and at the same time we should put into place the necessary precautions. So you need time to prepare for the gradual easing up of the situation, and especially to make preparation just in case a new variant of COVID-19 becomes more virulent. So you can still fight back to put the situation under control. So now after the 20th Party Congress, I hope, and many of my colleagues hope that we will gradually adjust our policy, becomes more flexible, and gradually ease up the restrictions, but in a way that is responsible to the lives of people, especially the aging people in China. We're not going to be like the United States. You just, open up everything and there's basically no control. I don't think that will happen in China.
The fact still remains. I've talked to a number of large investment firm CEOs and so on, and they point out that their investment in China is going to slow down unless this policy eases, right? That they're not going to be investing as much money in China as they used to. One, two, are we reading wrong here the volume of opposition that has now arisen to this policy?
Well, I think certainly you have different voices about the necessity of the current policy. I think the leaders are very much aware of this kind of opposing voices. I think the challenge for them is that they should try to strike a good balance between economic development and protection of the health and the lives of people. So as a leader, you don't just think about market. You should also think about health and lives. There is no easy answer to this issue because after all, this is a new pandemic and is still evolving. Nobody knows what will happen next month or next year. So in this process, you pay price for your policy, and that's it. So I think the leaders will continue to handle this issue in a careful way. But overall, I expect the policy will become more flexible.
So I want to tangent now to my report for the Foreign Policy Association, in which I argue, and please take this with all due respect, that politicians in both countries have failed to ease the relationship. So it's time to let the businessmen and women take charge, keep moving along, and that things will then soften on their own. What do you think?
Well, if we look at the economic ties between our two countries, that's the most important dimension of this relationship over the last several decades, since China's open up and reform in late 1970s and early 80s. And strong and robust economic ties have also played a role of stabilizing this relationship in time of crisis. However, what we have seen in the last several years is that for economic issues between two countries, wrong approach was adopted. That was during the Trump administration. I mean, he was concerned about trade imbalance. So he launched the trade war trying to solve this issue. That was counterproductive. So he picked up the wrong instrument to deal with economic problems. And for the Biden administration, they just try to securitize everything in this relationship, including economic relationship. They put trade, tariff, technology, everything in the basket of national security. So that hurts a lot the economic ties between two countries. So I think it's time, I agree with you on this point. It's time for leaders on both sides, especially for leaders in Washington, to hear the voices from the business community in the United States, their concern, their suggestions for how to improve this relationship. And after all, we are the two largest economies in the world. Economic relations do good to the benefits of both countries. We should not put all the economic issues in the basket of national basket of national security. So that's my reaction to your report. It's a good report. I hope your leaders, officials will read it carefully.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate what you've just said. We're a little bit over time, but this is such an important conversation that if you have 3 or 4 more minutes, I'd just like to continue on, Dr. Wu. And I just have 2 questions to end this conversation with. The first one concerns Fudan University. You have one of the most respected educational institutions, both in China and in America. And there have been numerous American students that have been going there. I wanted to ask you whether this impasse between our 2 countries has affected enrollment. I know the pandemic has, but do you think that the relations between the 2 countries? So that's one. And then I'd like to end by you, if you find a few minutes yourself alone with President Biden, what would you tell him that he should do? He should do one thing to improve our relations. So those are my last 2 questions for you.
Excellent questions. Well, for the first question, as I have seen in the last several years, because of a pandemic, and also because of the cooling of our bilateral relations, there has been fewer American students coming to study at Fudan, and there's also a visible drop in our students going to study in the United States. So this is a phenomenon of concern to both sides. And as someone who has benefited from the scholarly exchanges between our 2 countries, I really believe that young people from both countries going to study in the other country is very crucial to the relations of our 2 countries. So I hope that after the pandemic, both sides will make joint efforts to encourage our young people to study in the other country. Now, if I have a time to make one suggestion to President Biden, that will be, he has been in office for almost 2 years, and his national security team has met their Chinese counterparts several times, but his economic team has not met their Chinese counterparts for one time, not for one time. So it's time for the economic team for both countries to meet. And also, before the 2 economic teams meet, the business community from both China and the United States should have a dialogue. And then they should try to build consensus about how to promote the economic relations between our 2 countries. And then they will submit their suggestion to both President Biden and President Xi. So that will allow the business community in both countries to play an active and constructive role as they did in the past in this relationship. That's my suggestion.
Well, Dr. Wu, we have done what is, everyone would think, almost impossible and ended this conversation on a positive note. And I think we let that sit as a bit of an instruction to both our countries' officials. I'm afraid that's all the time we have. I want to profusely thank you for your time. I know how busy you are to appear on Polaris Live, and I hope we'll have the pleasure to have you on again.
Thank you, Sarwar. Good night from China.
Good night. Good morning from here. So thank you for our viewers from around the world. Please join us again for the next episode in this special series of programs in which 7 experts from China, the United States, and the Middle East offer their perspective on the relations between the 2 countries and the recently concluded 20th Chinese Communist Party conference in Beijing, and what the conference results mean for the U.S., China, and the world. Hope to see you again tomorrow. Until then, this is Sarwar Kashmiri. Goodbye.